Harold Bernstein found a ring that remembered him. In a dumpster behind a jewelry store on a cold November afternoon, he pulled from the trash a tarnished circle of gold bearing a crest he had seen before, though he could not say where. The metal was old, the engraving worn, but the symbol spoke to him in a language older than words. He carried it to the mansion on the hill, to the family whose name was carved into the streets of Boston, and when the old woman opened the door, she did not see a homeless man. She saw her son, subscribed to witness the moment a ghost becomes a man again. Chapter 1. The Weight of Invisible Things. Harold Bernstein had long ago stopped expecting anything from the world, and the world had returned the favor with a silence so complete it felt like erasure. He moved through the streets of Boston like a shadow cast by no light, his body bent under the weight of winters he could no longer count, his hands rough and cracked from the cold that never seemed to leave his bones. The city around him was old and proud, its brick buildings standing like sentinels over history, its cobblestone streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps that had never once paused for him. He had no home, no name that anyone spoke aloud, no face that anyone remembered after turning away. The invisibility had become a second skin, so familiar that he sometimes wondered if he had ever been anything else. If there had ever been a time when someone had looked at him and seen more than a man to step around. The dumpster behind the jewelry store on Newbury Street had become one of his regular stops, a place where the discarded sometimes held small treasures, broken clasps, tangled chains, scraps of leather that could be fashioned into something useful. He had learned over the years to see value in what others threw away, to find dignity in the act of salvage, to make a life from the margins of other people's abundance. On this particular afternoon, the November wind cut through his coat with the kind of cold that felt personal, deliberate, as though the season itself had singled him out for punishment. His fingers were numb as he lifted the lid, his breath forming clouds that dissolved into the grey air, and he almost missed it, the glint of gold half buried beneath crumpled tissue paper and velvet scraps. He reached in slowly, his heart beating with the cautious hope of someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust the small mercies of chance. The ring was heavier than it looked, its surface dulled by time and neglect. But even through the tarnish, he could see the engraving, the careful lines of a crest that stirred something deep and unsettling in his chest. He held it up to the pale light, turning it slowly in his palm, and the symbol seemed to pulse with a significance he could not name. A shield divided into quarters, a lion rampant on one side, a tree with spreading roots on the other, and beneath it all, a banner with letters too worn to read. He did not know why his hands were trembling, why his throat tightened as he stared at the piece of metal, why the world around him seemed to recede into a distant hum. It was just a ring, just another piece of refuse, and yet it felt like a door opening onto a room he had been locked out of for longer than he could remember. He slipped the ring into his pocket and walked away from the dumpster, his mind churning with a restlessness that had no clear direction. The streets were crowded with people rushing toward destinations he could not imagine, their faces hidden behind scarves and collars, their eyes fixed on screens or storefronts or the pavement ahead. No one looked at him, no one paused, and he moved among them like a current of cold air, felt but never seen. He had learned to accept this, to wear his invisibility like armor, but today it chafed against something raw inside him, something the ring had awakened. He thought about the crest, about the careful artistry of the engraving, about the way it had been thrown away, as though it meant nothing, and he wondered who it had belonged to, what hands had worn it, what life it had adorned before being discarded into the trash. By the time he reached the shelter on Harrison Avenue, the sky had darkened into the bruised purple of early evening, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. He sat on the steps outside, unwilling to go in yet, and pulled the ring from his pocket again, holding it close to his face so he could study every detail. The lion looked fierce, even in its worn state, its mouth open in a silent roar, its claws extended as though ready to strike. The tree was older, more patient, its roots spreading wide and deep, as though anchoring something that could not be moved. He traced the lines with his thumb, feeling the grooves and ridges, and a memory flickered at the edge of his consciousness. Not a full image, not a clear recollection, just a sensation, a feeling of standing somewhere vast and bright, of being someone who mattered. He closed his fist around the ring and felt the metal warm against his skin, and for the first time in years, Harold Bernstein allowed himself to wonder if the world had forgotten him, or if he had forgotten himself. The question hung in the cold air, unanswered, as the city moved on around him, indifferent and eternal. And he sat alone on the steps with a piece of gold that might mean nothing, or might mean everything, pressed against his palm, like a secret waiting to be told. Chapter 2. The city that remembers itself. Boston wore its history like a coat, too heavy to take off. The weight of centuries pressed into every brick and cobblestone, every plaque and monument declaring the importance of what had come before. Harold moved through this landscape of memory as a man without a past, his own history reduced to the vague outlines of survival, where to find food, where to sleep without being moved along, which alleys offered shelter from the wind, and which were claimed by others. He had no stories to tell about himself, no childhood to recall, no family to mourn or celebrate. The years stretched behind him in a fog so thick he could not see through it, and he had long ago stopped trying. Amnesia, the doctors at the free clinic had told him once, though they could not say what had caused it or whether it would ever lift. He had accepted it the way he accepted the cold and the hunger, as a condition of his existence, unchangeable and absolute. But the ring had changed something, had cracked open a door he did not know existed, and now he could not stop thinking about the crest, about the way it had felt familiar, even though he could not say why. He spent the next morning at the public library on Boylston Street, a place he visited often for its warmth and its bathrooms and the quiet anonymity it offered. He sat at one of the computers in the corner, his fingers clumsy on the keyboard, and searched for images of family crests, scrolling through page after page of shields and banners and symbols that meant nothing to him. He was about to give up when he saw it. The lion, the tree, the divided shield, all rendered in sharp digital clarity beneath a heading that made his breath catch in his throat. The Whitaker family crest, the caption read, and below it a brief history of the family that had founded Boston, that had built its first banks and hospitals, that had shaped the city into what it was today. He stared at the screen until his eyes burned, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The Whitakers were not just wealthy. They were woven into the fabric of the city itself, their name appearing on buildings and streets and endowments, their legacy so vast it seemed impossible that a ring bearing their crest could end up in a dumpster behind a jewelry store. He read through articles and genealogies, absorbing details about the family's rise and influence, but it was the photograph that stopped him cold, a black and white image from 50 years ago, showing a young man in a suit standing beside an older woman on the steps of a mansion. The caption identified them as Eleanor Whitaker and her son, and though the photograph was grainy and faded, Harold could not look away from the young man's face, from the shape of his jaw and the set of his eyes, from something he could not name, but felt in the deepest part of himself. He left the library in a daze, the ring burning in his pocket like a coal, and walked without direction through streets he had traversed 1,000 times, but now seemed strange and unfamiliar. The city looked different through the lens of what he had learned, its monuments and buildings suddenly personal, as though they were speaking directly to him in a language he had forgotten but was beginning to remember. He passed the Whitaker building on State Street, a towering structure of glass and steel, and felt a pull toward it that was both magnetic and terrifying. He did not belong in that world, did not belong anywhere near the gleaming lobbies and polished floors, and yet the ring in his pocket insisted otherwise. Its weight, a constant reminder that he was connected to something larger than the small, invisible life he had been living. By the time he reached the common, the sun was high and bright, cutting through the November chill with a clarity that made everything sharp and vivid. He sat on a bench near the pond and watched the ducks glide across the water, their movements effortless and unburdened, and he thought about the young man in the photograph, about the life that had been frozen in that moment before it was lost. He did not know if he was that man, did not know if the connection he felt was real or just the desperate hope of someone who had been invisible for too long. But he knew he could not walk away from the ring, could not pretend he had never found it. The question was what to do next, how to take a piece of gold and turn it into proof, into a story that someone might believe. He pulled the ring out again and held it up to the light. Watching the way the sun caught the engraving and made the lion seem to move, the tree seemed to sway. The crest was more than a symbol. It was a claim, a declaration of identity, and he realized with a clarity that felt like waking from a long sleep that he had to take it to the family, had to stand before them and offer it back, not because he expected anything, but because it was the only way to know if the connection he felt was real. The decision settled over him like a weight and a relief at the same time, and he stood up from the bench, his legs unsteady beneath him, and began walking toward Beacon Hill, toward the mansion that had always been there, looming over the city like a monument to everything he was not. The walk took longer than he expected, his body protesting every step, but he did not stop, did not turn back, because the ring in his pocket was a compass pulling him forward, and he had no choice but to follow where it led. Chapter 3. The mansion on the hill, Beacon Hill, rose above the city like a crown. Its narrow streets lined with brick townhouses that gleamed with old money and older pride, their black shutters and gas lamps speaking of a time when Boston was the center of the world and the families who lived here were its architects. Harold had walked these streets before, but always at the edges, always as someone passing through, never daring to linger or look too long at the lives being lived behind those tall windows. Today was different. Today, he was walking with purpose, the ring in his pocket giving him a kind of permission he had never felt before, a right to be here that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with the weight of gold against his thigh. The Whitaker mansion stood at the top of the hill, a massive Georgian structure of red brick and white columns, its grounds surrounded by a wrought-iron fence that seemed designed not to keep people out, but to remind them of the distance between inside and outside, between belonging and longing. Harold stopped at the gate and stared up at the house, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, and for a moment he considered turning back, walking away, pretending he had never found the ring or learned the name that went with it. But the moment passed, and he reached out and pushed the gate open, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped onto the brick path that led to the front door. The walk to the door felt like crossing a border into a country where he did not speak the language, where every rule was different and every gesture carried a meaning he could not decode. He moved slowly, his eyes taking in the manicured gardens and the ivy climbing the walls, the stone urns flanking the entrance and the brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Everything about the place spoke of permanence, of a life built to last across generations, and he felt the weight of his own impermanence, his own fragility, pressing down on him like a hand on his shoulder. He raised his fist to knock and hesitated, his knuckles hovering inches from the door, and in that moment he allowed himself to imagine what would happen when it opened. How the person on the other side would look at him, what words he would use to explain why he was here. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and a woman stood before him, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and clear, her silver hair pulled back in a way that seemed both severe and elegant. She was dressed in a dark blue dress that looked expensive but understated, and she held herself with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being watched, of knowing that every movement was a performance. She looked at Harold without flinching, without the automatic recoil he had come to expect, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a thread pulled taut. He found his voice first, though it came out rough and uncertain, shaped by years of disuse. He told her his name, told her he had found something that belonged to her family, and he pulled the ring from his pocket and held it out toward her, the gold catching the afternoon light and throwing small sparks across the space between them. She stared at the ring, her expression unreadable, and then she reached out and took it from his palm, her fingers brushing his for just a second, and the contact felt electric, as though something had passed between them that neither of them understood. She turned the ring over in her hands, her eyes tracing the crest with a focus so intense it seemed to erase everything else, and when she looked up at him again, her face had changed, had opened into something raw and unguarded. She said one word, her voice barely a whisper, and the word was a name. And the name was not Harold, but something else, something he had not heard in so long, it felt like a language from another life. She said it again, louder this time, and her hand reached out and touched his face, her fingers trembling as they traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheek, and she was crying now. Tears streaming down her face unchecked, and Harold felt something inside him break open, a flood of emotion so overwhelming he could not name it or contain it. She pulled him inside, her grip on his arm fierce and desperate, and the door closed behind them, shutting out the world, shutting out the cold, and he stood in the entrance hall of the mansion, surrounded by portraits and chandeliers and the scent of old wood and polish, and for the first time in decades, he felt like he had come home. Chapter 4. The Room of Ghosts. Eleanor Whitaker led him through the mansion like a woman moving through a dream, her steps slow but deliberate, her hand never leaving his arm, as though she feared he might vanish if she let go. Harold followed, his eyes wide and overwhelmed, taking in the grandeur of rooms he had no memory of, but that felt familiar in a way he could not explain. The walls were lined with paintings of stern-faced men and elegant women, their eyes following him as he passed, and he wondered if any of them were ancestors, if their blood ran in his veins, if he had ever stood in this hall as a child and looked up at these same faces. The thought was dizzying, impossible, and yet the ring in Eleanor's hand was proof of something, and her tears were proof of something more. She led him to a sitting room at the back of the house, a space filled with soft light from tall windows that overlooked a garden gone dormant for winter. The furniture was old but immaculate, the kind of pieces that had been chosen not for fashion but for permanence, for the expectation that they would outlast the people who sat in them. Eleanor gestured for him to sit, and he lowered himself onto a velvet chair that felt too fine for his worn clothes, his hands gripping the armrests as though to steady himself against the unreality of the moment. She sat across from him, the ring still clutched in her hand, and for a long time she simply stared at him, her eyes moving over his face with a hunger that was both tender and desperate. She began to speak, her voice shaking but steady, and she told him a story he had never heard, but that explained everything and nothing at the same time. She told him about a fire 50 years ago, a blaze that had consumed the west wing of the mansion in the middle of the night, a tragedy that had taken her son from her in a way that left no body to bury, no closure to grasp. She told him how they had searched the ruins for days, how they had found nothing but ash and twisted metal, how they had held a memorial service for a boy who had simply ceased to exist. She told him about the ring, the signet ring that her husband had given their son on his 16th birthday, a symbol of his place in the family, of the legacy he would one day inherit. The ring had disappeared in the fire, presumed lost forever, and she had mourned it almost as much as she had mourned her son. Harold listened, his mind struggling to connect the story she was telling to the life he had lived, to the decades of wandering and forgetting, to the man he had become. He had no memory of a fire, no memory of a family or a mansion or a life before the streets. The amnesia had erased everything, had left him with only the present moment, only the slow accumulation of days that blurred into one another without distinction. But as Eleanor spoke, something stirred in the back of his mind, a flicker of sensation that was not quite memory, but felt like its shadow, the smell of smoke, the sound of glass breaking, the feeling of heat so intense it seemed to burn through his skin. He closed his eyes and tried to hold on to the sensation, to pull it forward into clarity, but it slipped away like water through his fingers, leaving only the ache of something lost. Eleanor saw the struggle on his face and leaned forward, her hand reaching out to cover his, and she told him there was a way to know for certain, a way to turn hope into proof. She spoke of a test, of science that could read the truth written in their blood, and Harold nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything but trust that she knew what she was doing, that she could guide him through this maze of possibility and impossibility. She made a phone call, her voice crisp and authoritative, and within the hour a man in a white coat arrived with a small case, and Harold watched as he took samples, watched as Eleanor did the same, watched as the man promised results within days and left them alone again in the sitting room with nothing to do but wait. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation and fear, with the knowledge that everything was about to change or stay exactly the same, and Harold could not decide which outcome terrified him more. Eleanor sat across from him, the ring back on her finger now, turning it slowly as though it were a talisman that could make the impossible real, and he saw in her face the same mixture of hope and dread that he felt in his own chest. She asked him about his life, about the years he had spent on the streets, and he tried to tell her, tried to find words for the coldness and the hunger and the invisibility, but it all sounded too small, too quiet, as though the life he had lived was too insubstantial to matter in the face of what might be true. When the light began to fade and the room filled with shadows, Eleanor insisted he stay, insisted that he sleep in a guest room upstairs rather than return to the shelter or the streets. He wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the distance between who he was and who he might be, but she would not hear it, and he found himself following her up a grand staircase, his feet sinking into carpet so thick it felt like walking on clouds. And she opened a door to a room that was larger than any space he had occupied in decades. She left him there with a promise to see him in the morning, and when the door closed, Harold stood in the center of the room and let the tears come, silent and unstoppable, because he did not know who he was crying for, the boy who had been lost, or the man who might never have existed at all. Undies Tidun to Chapter 5. The days of waiting time moved differently in the mansion, each hour stretching and contracting in ways that defied Harold's understanding, as though the house itself existed outside the normal flow of seconds and minutes. He spent the days waiting for the test results in a kind of limbo, suspended between the life he had known and the life that might be his, unable to fully inhabit either. Eleanor was a constant presence, hovering nearby with a mixture of hope and anxiety that mirrored his own, and though she did not press him with questions, he could feel her eyes on him, studying his face, searching for traces of the boy she had lost. He tried to give her what she needed, tried to remember, but the past remained stubbornly out of reach, a locked door with no key. He wandered the mansion like a guest in a museum, his hands clasped behind his back to avoid touching anything, his steps careful and deliberate so as not to disturb the order of things. Every room was a shrine to a life he could not access, filled with objects that should have been familiar but felt alien. The grand piano in the music room, the leather-bound books in the library, the portraits lining the walls with their silent, judging eyes. He stopped in front of one painting in particular, a portrait of a young boy with dark hair and serious eyes, and Eleanor came to stand beside him, her voice soft as she told him the painting had been commissioned for his 10th birthday, that the artist had captured something essential about him, a quality of quiet determination. Harold stared at the boy's face and tried to see himself in it, tried to feel the connection, but all he felt was the distance, the unbridgeable gap between who that boy had been and who he had become. At night, he lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, the creak of old wood and the whisper of wind against the windows. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that felt more like memories but dissolved the moment he woke, leaving only the residue of emotion, fear, confusion, a sense of loss so profound it felt like drowning. He dreamed of fire, of flames that consumed everything they touched, of smoke so thick he could not see or breathe, of a voice calling his name, a name he could not quite hear. He woke gasping, his body drenched in sweat, and for a moment he did not know where he was, could not reconcile the softness of the bed beneath him with the hardness of the life he had been living. Eleanor found him one morning in the garden, standing among the bare rose bushes and the frost-covered statues, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. She brought him a cup of coffee, the steam rising between them like a veil, and they stood together in silence, watching the city spread out below the hill, its buildings and streets stretching toward the horizon in a pattern that seemed both random and deliberate. She told him about the boy he might have been, about his love of books and his fear of storms, about the way he used to hide in the library during thunderstorms and read by flashlight until the danger had passed. She told him about his father, a man who had died when the boy was young, leaving Eleanor to raise him alone, to shape him into the heir the family needed. She spoke with a longing that was almost unbearable, and Harold felt the weight of her grief pressing down on him, the knowledge that he might be the answer to her prayers, or just another cruel trick of hope. The call came on the 4th day, the phone ringing through the house like an alarm, and Eleanor answered it in the study with Harold standing beside her, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest. He watched her face as she listened, saw the color drain from her cheeks and then flood back in a rush of red, saw her eyes widen and then fill with tears. And when she hung up the phone, she turned to him and said the words that changed everything. The test was positive. He was her son. The boy who had been lost in the fire had survived, had walked away with no memory of who he was, had lived for 50 years as a ghost in his own city, and now he was home. She reached for him, and he let her pull him into an embrace that felt like falling and flying at the same time, her body shaking with sobs that were equal parts joy and sorrow, and he held her because he did not know what else to do, did not know how to process the enormity of what he had just learned. He was not Harold Bernstein, not entirely, not anymore. He was someone else, someone with a history and a name and a place in the world, and the knowledge was both a gift and a burden, a door opening onto a life he could not remember but could no longer deny. He closed his eyes and let the tears come, and for the first time in 50 years, He allowed himself to believe that he mattered, that he had always mattered, even when the world had forgotten him. Chapter 6. The Reclamation of Self. The days that followed were a blur of lawyers and documents, of signatures and legal declarations that transformed Harold from a man with no past into the sole heir of the Whittaker fortune. Eleanor moved with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this moment for half a century. Her grief alchemized into action, and Harold could only watch as his life was reconstructed around him, as the systems of wealth and power that had been invisible to him for so long suddenly opened to reveal his place within them. He was measured for new clothes, fitted for shoes that did not pinch or leak, given a room that was not a guest space but his own, filled with things that had belonged to him as a boy. A desk, a bookshelf, a collection of model ships that he did not remember building but that felt somehow right. Eleanor brought him photographs, albums filled with images of a life he could not recall, birthday parties and holidays, school portraits and family gatherings, moments frozen in time that should have been his but felt like they belonged to someone else. He studied the faces in the photographs, his younger self smiling beside Eleanor, beside other children whose names meant nothing to him. And he tried to feel the connection, tried to summon the memories that should have been there. But the amnesia held fast, a wall he could not breach, and he was left with the strange dissonance of knowing he was this person while feeling like an imposter inhabiting someone else's life. He asked Eleanor about the fire, about the night that had erased everything, and she told him what she knew, though the details were vague and painful. The fire had started in the West Wing, in the room where he had been sleeping, and the investigators had never been able to determine the cause. She had been in another part of the house, had woken to the smell of smoke and the sound of alarms, and by the time she reached his room, the flames were too intense, the heat too great, and the firefighters had pulled her back, had told her it was too late. They had searched the ruins for days, but the fire had been so hot that it had consumed everything, leaving only ash and fragments of metal. They had assumed he had perished, had held a service and buried an empty casket, and Eleanor had lived with the guilt of not being able to save him, of failing in the one task that mattered most. Harold listened and felt the weight of her grief, the decades of mourning that she had carried alone, and he understood that his return was not just his own reclamation, but hers as well, a chance for her to undo the loss that had defined her life. He wanted to give her the son she remembered, wanted to be the person she had mourned, but he did not know how to bridge the gap between who he had been and who he was now. The boy in the photographs was a stranger, and the man in the mirror was a stranger too, a hybrid of the life he had lived on the streets and the life he was being told to reclaim. He felt unmoored, adrift in a sea of identity with no anchor to hold him steady. Eleanor seemed to sense his struggle and gave him space, allowing him to wander the mansion and the grounds, to sit in the library and read the books he might have read as a boy, to walk through the city and see it through new eyes. He found himself drawn back to the places he had known as a homeless man, the shelters and soup kitchens, the corners where he had slept, and the alleys where he had hidden from the cold. He saw the people there, the men and women who were still living the life he had left behind, and he felt a pull toward them, a kinship that was stronger than the connection he felt to the mansion and its wealth. He gave away money, handed out bills to anyone who asked, and when Eleanor found out, she did not scold him but simply nodded, as though she understood that this was part of who he was, part of the man he had become through all those years of loss. One evening, as the sun set over the city and the lights began to flicker on across the skyline, Harold stood in the library and pulled a book from the shelf at random. It was a volume of poetry, the pages yellowed and brittle, and when he opened it, a slip of paper fell out, a bookmark with a child's handwriting scrawled across it. The words were simple, a line from a poem he did not recognize. But as he read them, something shifted inside him, a door cracking open just enough to let in a sliver of light. He closed his eyes and let the sensation wash over him, and for a moment he was not in the library, but somewhere else, somewhere bright and warm. And he could hear a voice reading to him, a woman's voice, soft and steady, and he felt safe, felt loved, felt whole. The moment passed, the memory slipping away before he could hold it, but it left behind a trace, a proof that somewhere deep inside him the boy still existed, waiting to be found. Chapter 7. The Fracture of Two Lives. The integration of Harold's two lives proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The seams between who he had been and who he was now fraying under the weight of expectation and obligation. Eleanor wanted him to attend dinners and galas, to meet the family's friends and business associates, to step into the role of heir with the grace and confidence of someone who had been preparing for it his whole life. But Harold could not shake the feeling that he was performing, that he was wearing a costume that did not fit, that at any moment someone would see through the illusion and call him out as a fraud. He attended the events because Eleanor asked him to, because he owed her that much. But he stood at the edges of the rooms, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning for exits, and he counted the minutes until he could leave. The other guests looked at him with curiosity and skepticism, their eyes traveling from his face to his clothes and back again, and he could feel their judgment, their unspoken questions about where he had been and what he had done, about how a man could lose 50 years and still be considered worthy of the name he now carried. Some of them were kind, offering condolences and congratulations in the same breath. But others were cold, their smiles tight and their words clipped, and Harold understood that his return had disrupted something, had upset the balance of power and inheritance that had been settled in his absence. He did not care about the money or the status, but he saw how much it mattered to others, how his very existence was a threat to plans and expectations that had been built on the assumption of his death. Eleanor defended him fiercely, her voice sharp and unyielding when anyone dared to question his legitimacy, and Harold loved her for it, even as he wished she would let him slip back into the invisibility he had known. He tried to tell her this one night, tried to explain that he did not need the wealth or the recognition, that he would be just as happy living a simpler life, but she would not hear it. She told him that he had been robbed of his birthright, that he had suffered enough, that he deserved to reclaim everything that had been taken from him. She spoke with a passion that was almost desperate, and Harold realized that this was not just about him, that it was about her need to restore what had been broken, to make whole the family that had been shattered by the fire. But the mansion felt like a cage, no matter how gilded, and Harold found himself slipping out at night, walking the streets he had known as a homeless man, seeking the freedom and anonymity that had once been his only possessions. He visited the shelters, sat with the men and women who still lived on the margins, and listened to their stories with an attention that came from deep understanding. They did not know who he was, did not recognize him as the heir to the Whittaker fortune, and he was grateful for that. Grateful to be just Harold again, to be seen not for what he represented, but for who he was in that moment. He gave them what he could, money, food, a listening ear, and in return they gave him something more valuable, a reminder that identity was not fixed, that a person could be many things at once, and that the life he had lived on the streets was no less real than the life he was being asked to live now. Eleanor found out about his night walks and confronted him in the library, her face a mixture of anger and hurt, and she demanded to know why he was risking his safety, why he could not simply accept the life she was trying to give him. He tried to explain that he was not rejecting her or the family, that he was simply trying to find a way to hold both versions of himself without losing either one. But the words came out tangled and insufficient, and he saw the pain in her eyes deepen. She told him that the boy she had lost would never have chosen the streets over the home she had built for him, that she had waited 50 years to have her son back. And now that he was here, he was slipping through her fingers all over again. Her voice broke on the last words, and Harold felt something crack inside him, a fissure opening between the loyalty he owed her and the loyalty he owed to the man he had become through all those years of survival. He reached for her hand and held it gently, and he told her that he was trying, that he wanted to be the son she remembered, but that the amnesia had not just erased his memories. It had created a new person, someone who had learned to live without roots, without history, without the weight of expectations. He told her that he was grateful for everything she had given him, for the proof of his identity and the chance to reclaim his name, but that he needed time to reconcile the two halves of himself, to find a way to be both the boy who had been lost and the man who had survived. Eleanor listened, her face softening, and when he finished, she pulled him into an embrace that felt like forgiveness and surrender at the same time, and they stood together in the quiet of the library, two people bound by blood and loss, trying to build a bridge across 50 years of silence. Chapter 8. The man who remembered the memories began to return in fragments, not all at once, but in slow, deliberate pieces, like a puzzle assembling itself one corner at a time. Harold would be walking through the mansion or the city, and suddenly a scent or a sound would trigger something. A flash of image or emotion that lasted only a second, but left behind a residue of recognition. He smelled lavender, and remembered a woman's hands tucking him into bed, her voice humming a song he could not name. He heard the creak of a floorboard and remembered running down a hallway, his feet bare and quick, laughter trailing behind him. He saw a tree in the garden lose its last leaves and remembered climbing that same tree as a boy, the bark rough against his palms, the world spread out below him like a map he was just learning to read. Each memory was a gift and a wound, a reclamation of something lost, but also a reminder of everything that had been stolen. Harold wrote them down in a notebook Eleanor gave him, trying to capture the details before they faded, and slowly a picture began to emerge of the boy he had been, curious and bookish, prone to solitude but not lonely, loved fiercely by a mother who had built her entire world around him. He saw himself in the library reading until his eyes hurt, saw himself at the dinner table listening to his father talk about business and legacy, saw himself standing in front of the mirror practicing the signature he would one day use to sign his name to documents that mattered. The boy in his memories was not a stranger anymore, but he was not fully Harold either, and the dissonance between the two created a tension that he carried in his chest like a stone. Eleanor noticed the change in him, the way his eyes grew distant when a memory surfaced, the way his hands trembled when he spoke about the fragments he was recovering. She began to tell him stories more freely, filling in the gaps with her own recollections, and together they pieced together a narrative that was part truth and part reconstruction, a life assembled from the shards of what remained. She told him about the night of the fire, about how she had woken to the sound of breaking glass and the smell of smoke, about how she had run to his room and found the door engulfed in flames, about how she had screamed his name until her voice gave out. She told him that the firefighters had pulled her back, had told her there was no hope, and that she had stood in the garden, watching the west wing burn, knowing that her son was inside and that she could do nothing to save him. Harold listened and felt the fire in his own body, felt the heat and the terror, and suddenly he was there, not in memory but in lived experience, the walls closing in around him, the smoke filling his lungs, the fear so overwhelming it erased thought. He remembered stumbling toward the window, his hands burning as he pushed it open, the cold air rushing in to meet the heat, and he remembered falling, the ground rushing up to meet him, the impact knocking the breath from his body. He remembered crawling away from the house, his clothes smouldering, his mind already fracturing under the weight of trauma, and he remembered the darkness that followed, the erasure of everything he had been, the descent into a void where names and faces and history ceased to exist. The memory was complete, and it was unbearable, and he doubled over with the force of it, his body convulsing with sobs that came from a place deeper than grief. Eleanor held him as he wept, her own tears falling onto his hair, and they mourned together for the boy who had been lost, and the decades that had been stolen, for the life that should have been and the life that was. When the tears finally subsided, Harold looked up at her and saw in her face a reflection of his own pain, and he understood that they were both survivors of the same fire, that they had both been burned and scarred and forced to rebuild themselves from ash. He told her that he remembered, that he knew now who he had been and how he had survived, and she smiled through her tears and told him that she had never stopped believing, that some part of her had always known he was alive, that a mother's love was a force stronger than fire or time or forgetting. The days that followed were quieter, softer, as though the reclamation of memory had brought with it a kind of peace. Harold still walked the streets at night, still visited the shelters, and sat with the men and women who had been his companions in invisibility. But now he did so not as an escape, but as a bridge, a way of honoring both the life he had lived and the life he was reclaiming. He established a foundation in his own name, a fund to support the homeless and displaced, to provide resources and dignity to those who had been forgotten by the world. Eleanor supported the effort with her full backing, and together they turned his 50 years of suffering into something redemptive, something that mattered beyond the boundaries of their own story. One morning, as the first snow of winter began to fall over Boston, Harold stood in the library and looked out at the city, at the streets and buildings that had been both prison and home, and he felt a sense of completeness that he had never known before. He was not just the boy who had been lost in the fire, and he was not just the man who had survived on the streets. He was both, and he was neither, and he was something new entirely. A person forged in the space between memory and forgetting, between wealth and poverty, between death and rebirth. Eleanor came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his, and they watched the snow fall together in silence. Two souls bound by love and loss, finally whole. The years that followed did not erase the past, but they softened its edges, turned the sharp wounds into scars that Harold could trace with his fingers and remember without bleeding. The mansion on Beacon Hill became a home in the truest sense, not because of its grandeur or its history, but because it held within its walls the slow, patient work of two people learning to be a family again. Eleanor moved through the rooms with a lightness she had not possessed in decades. Her grief transmuted into something quieter, something that allowed for laughter and small joys and the simple pleasure of sharing breakfast with her son. Harold moved beside her, no longer a ghost but a presence, solid and real. And though the memories continued to return in pieces, he had learned to accept them as gifts rather than burdens, fragments of a life that was his to claim or release as he chose. He never fully abandoned the streets, never severed the connection to the world he had inhabited for 50 years, because to do so would have been to deny a part of himself that mattered as much as the boy who had survived the fire. He walked through Boston as both heir and wanderer, his feet carrying him from the polished floors of boardrooms to the cracked pavement of alleys, and in this duality he found a kind of freedom that wealth alone could never have purchased. The foundation he had established grew beyond anything he had imagined, funding shelters and clinics and programs that treated the homeless not as problems to be solved, but as people deserving of dignity and care. He sat on the board of directors alongside Eleanor, and together they made decisions that redirected the Whittaker fortune toward something more meaningful than its own perpetuation, toward a legacy built on compassion rather than conquest. The city began to change around him, or perhaps he simply began to see it differently, the invisible made visible through the lens of his own transformation. He recognized faces he had known from his years on the streets, men and women who had aged alongside him in the margins, and he approached them not with pity, but with respect, offering help when it was wanted and companionship when it was needed more. Some of them knew who he was now, had read the articles or heard the rumors about the homeless man who had turned out to be a lost heir, and they looked at him with a mixture of wonder and wariness, unsure whether to trust that he had not forgotten them in his ascent. He proved himself through consistency, through showing up day after day, year after year, until they understood that the wealth had not changed him in the ways that mattered, that the man who sat beside them in the shelter was the same man who had once shared their bread and their silence. Eleanor watched his work with pride and occasional anxiety, her maternal instinct still attuned to the dangers he might face, the ways the world could harm him if he ventured too far into its darker corners. But she had learned to trust him, to understand that his need to bridge the two halves of his life was not a rejection of her or the family, but an affirmation of his wholeness, a refusal to be defined by only one version of himself. She accompanied him sometimes on his visits to the shelters, her presence causing a stir among the staff and residents who had never imagined that the matriarch of the Whittaker family would walk through their doors, but she moved among them with a grace that spoke of genuine care rather than performative charity. Harold watched her interact with the people he had known, saw the way she listened to their stories with the same intensity she had once reserved for him, and he understood that his return had not just healed her, but had opened her to a wider world, had reminded her that loss and love existed far beyond the walls of the mansion. The memories continued to surface, though less frequently now, as though the well had been mostly drawn, and what remained were the deeper, harder truths that took longer to excavate. He remembered his father more clearly, a man who had been both stern and affectionate, who had expected greatness but had also known how to laugh, whose death had left a void that Harold had tried to fill by being the perfect son, the perfect heir. He remembered the pressure of those expectations, the weight of knowing that an entire legacy rested on his shoulders, and he wondered if the fire had been a kind of escape, if some part of him had welcomed the erasure of that burden, even as it had stolen everything else. The thought disturbed him, suggested a complicity in his own disappearance that he did not want to examine too closely, but he could not entirely dismiss it, could not ignore the way the amnesia had freed him from the impossible task of living up to a name that had been built over generations. He spoke to Eleanor about this one evening as they sat in the library, the fire crackling in the hearth and the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, and he asked her if she thought he had wanted to disappear, if the boy he had been had somehow chosen the forgetting as a way out of the life that had been mapped for him. She was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant with thought, and when she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. She told him that trauma did not ask permission, that the mind protected itself in ways that had nothing to do with desire or choice, and that whatever had happened in the fire had been survival, not escape. She told him that the boy he had been had loved his family, had loved the mansion and the city and the life he was meant to inherit, but that love and fear could coexist, that he could have been both devoted and overwhelmed, and that the fire had simply broken something that could not be mended in the moment, only slowly rebuilt over time. Her words settled over him like a benediction, releasing him from the guilt he had been carrying without realizing it, and he reached for her hand and held it as the fire burned down to embers. He told her that he was grateful, not for the fire or the decades of loss, but for the chance to return, for the opportunity to build a life that honored both who he had been and who he had become. He told her that he loved her, the words still awkward on his tongue, but no less true for their unfamiliarity. And she smiled and told him that she had never stopped loving him, that a mother's love was a constant that survived fire and time and even the erasure of memory. They sat together in the quiet, two people who had found each other across an impossible distance, and the silence between them was not empty, but full, brimming with all the things that did not need to be said. The city continued to change, the years bringing new buildings and new faces, but the Whitaker mansion remained a constant, a landmark not just of history, but of renewal, of the possibility that what was lost could be found, and what was broken could be mended. Harold walked its halls with a sense of belonging that had taken years to cultivate, and he no longer felt like an imposter or a guest, but like someone who had earned his place through the work of integration, through the slow, patient labor of becoming whole. He kept the ring Eleanor had returned to him, the signet ring that had started everything, and he wore it on his right hand as a reminder of the journey he had taken, from the dumpster behind the jewelry store to the mansion on the hill, from invisibility to recognition, from forgetting to remembering. He thought often about the men and women who were still living the life he had left behind, who had not found their own rings or their own families, who remained invisible to a world that had no use for them. He carried their names and faces with him like a litany, a reminder that his story was an exception rather than a rule, that for every person reclaimed, there were thousands still lost, and he dedicated himself to narrowing that gap, to building systems and structures that offered not just charity but justice, not just help but dignity. The foundation expanded its reach, opening centers across the city and beyond, and Harold insisted that every program be designed with input from the people it was meant to serve, that the voices of the homeless and displaced be centered rather than silenced. It was slow work, frustrating and imperfect, but it mattered in ways that the accumulation of wealth never could, and he found in it a purpose that gave shape to his days and meaning to his survival. Eleanor lived to see the foundation flourish, lived to see her son fully inhabit the life he had reclaimed, and when she passed away at the age of 90, she did so with a peace that had eluded her for most of her life. Harold sat beside her in her final hours, holding her hand as she slipped away, and he told her stories about the boy he had been and the man he had become, weaving together the two halves of his life into a single narrative that honored them both. She smiled as she listened, her eyes clear and focused despite her failing body, and she told him that he had given her the greatest gift, not just by coming back, but by choosing to stay, by building a life that was worth the 50 years of waiting. She closed her eyes and took her last breath with his name on her lips, and Harold felt the loss like a second fire, a burning that consumed something essential, but he did not let it destroy him. He mourned her deeply and fully, allowed himself to grieve without shame or restraint, and when the funeral was over and the guests had gone, he returned to the mansion and sat in the library, and remembered every moment they had shared since his return. The years continued their steady march, and Harold grew older in the house that had once been a mystery to him, but now held no secrets, only memories layered like sediment, each one contributing to the foundation of who he was. He never married, never had children of his own, but he became a father figure to dozens of people whose lives intersected with his through the foundation, offering guidance and support and the assurance that they were seen, that they mattered. He thought sometimes about the parallel life he might have lived if the fire had never happened. If he had grown up in the mansion as the heir everyone expected him to be, and he could not decide whether that version of himself would have been happier or more fulfilled, whether the smooth path would have been preferable to the broken one he had walked. The question was ultimately unanswerable, a speculation about a life that existed only in imagination, and he chose to focus instead on the life he had, on the people he had helped, and the changes he had made, on the small, persistent acts of kindness that added up to something larger than himself. He walked the streets of Boston until his body could no longer carry him, until age and illness confined him to the mansion, and even then he continued the work through phone calls and video conferences, through conversations with the directors and staff who had taken up the mission he had started. He watched from his window as the city moved through its seasons, the snow giving way to spring and summer and fall and back to snow again, the cycle endless and reassuring, and he felt a gratitude that was almost overwhelming for the chance to have lived this particular life, with all its pain and beauty, all its loss and recovery. When his own end approached, he faced it with the same quiet acceptance he had brought to everything else, and he asked to be buried not in the grand Whitaker plot, but in a simpler cemetery, where the men and women he had known from the streets were also laid to rest, so that even in death he could remain connected to both halves of himself. The ring passed to the foundation, displayed in a case at the entrance to the main building, and beneath it a plaque told the story of the homeless man who had found it in the trash and followed it home, a reminder that identity was not fixed, but fluid, that a person could be lost and lost again and still somehow end up whole. The story became part of the city's mythology, passed down through generations, and people came from across the country to see the ring and hear the tale of Harold Whitaker, the man who had lived two lives and made both of them matter. The foundation continued its work long after his death, funded by the fortune he had inherited and directed by the principles he had established, and it stood as a living monument to the idea that wealth was not an end in itself, but a tool for building a more just and compassionate world. Boston moved on, as cities do, its streets filling with new faces and new stories, but the mansion on Beacon Hill remained, its windows glowing with light in the darkness, and those who looked up at it as they passed could sense that it held within its walls something rare and precious, not just history, but redemption, not just legacy, but love. The homeless men and women who walked those same streets knew the story, carried it with them like a talisman, and when they looked up at the mansion, they saw not a symbol of everything they lacked, but a reminder that transformation was possible, that the world could still surprise them, that even the most invisible among them might one day be seen. And in that seeing, in that recognition of their humanity, Harold Whitaker's true legacy endured, a ripple spreading outward across time and space, touching lives he would never know, changing a city one person at a time, proving that the ring he had found in the trash had been more than gold, more than symbol. It had been a key, unlocking a door between two worlds, and through that door had walked a man who refused to choose between them, who carried both with him until the end, and who left behind a story that would never be forgotten.